Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Christy Nuds. I am the editor of Food in Canada magazine. On behalf of Food in Canada, which is Canada's only national food and beverage processing magazine, and the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology, welcome to our 2021 Table Talks webinar series, The Learning Trough, where we will bring you regular webinars that explore the future of food. If you haven't already, please visit CIFST's website for a list of upcoming webinars, which will continue every second week until June, and then run again between September and November. If you are a member of CIFST, registration for the entire webinar series is free. And we'd like to give a big thank you today to Dempsey Food for their generous sponsorship of this webinar series. Today's topic is supply chains and food CPG, readiness for a post-pandemic future. Our speaker today is Mark Juhas. Mark is research associate at the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. He has a PhD from the OAC at the University of Guelph and has worked for nearly 20 years in agri-food and CPG consumer and market research with public, private, and NGO organizations across Canada and internationally. Before we get started today, we're introducing a new feature this year to our webinar series just to help all of you get to know our speakers a little bit better. So we'd like to ask Mark two questions today. The first question, so Mark, during COVID, did you take up baking? And if you did, what is your favorite item to bake?
Thank you for the question, Christy, and happy to be here with everybody. I hope we have a good learning opportunity. And to answer the question, my household is quite unique. My partner, she's actually a chef, so we have lots of good food. But I have actually started baking, and I love baking an old classic, which is chocolate brownies. And I like putting on walnuts or pecans and mixing them in. And then with the family, we usually have a nice scoop of ice cream and raspberries on top. So that never gets boring for this house.
That sounds great. And during COVID, what have you missed the most?
I think I miss live music. I miss live music. I love seeing live music, and I like going to see movies. But I think if I had to pick one, it's I still keep in touch with my friends online or by phone or sometimes for a social distance walk. But some of those cultural events is something that I'm looking forward to as soon as it's available again.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And before I turn it over to Mark, I just want to mention to everyone that if you have any questions today, please write them in the question box. I will be moderating any questions at the end, and Mark will attempt to answer them before the webinar. And if he doesn't get a chance to, we copy the questions, and Mark will respond to you via email. Please, everyone, welcome Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Chrissy. So hello, everyone. I look forward to what this can spark in terms of questions. As was mentioned, I'm with the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. And at the end, I've left links if anybody has questions, or of course, we could answer them as well. Towards the end, I've left some time. So the topic for today is supply chains and food consumer packaged goods. Specifically, in the pandemic that we're almost a year at now, about 11 months that we've been here inside the pandemic and what's that meant and the ups and downs of that. Supply chains have really been brought to attention as a result of what the pandemic has brought. Some elements before the pandemic were already on the radar, but now more so than ever, the pandemic and what the future might bring after the pandemic, there's some potential forecasts for us to consider. The presentation is organized into three key themes that I'd like to focus on, and then subtopics in that. The first is the real impact of the COVID-19 on food packaged goods supply chain. So I'll speak briefly about sourcing raw ingredients, inventory, storage, and prices as a result, SMEs, so small and medium enterprises and their vulnerability in many cases, and then particular use a case study example of meat processing plants and worker safety. The second is critical factors of consideration for food packaged goods. So what are issues around operating costs and new operating costs, ingredient and packaging substitutions, upstream demand, so that's pressures from retailers and consumers on where they're getting their and then what are their expectations from packaged goods. sustainability initiatives, which will not be going away, and what that implies, and the digitization of the supply chain. And then I will wrap up with elements of this new normal. A forecast, but with strong horizon scanning indicators to say that responsive supply chains, adaptive, flexible, responsive supply chains will be very important for consumer consumer goods, and advanced procurement strategies as well. Procurement is a major theme here as well. So the sources of these insights were from a range of different studies very recently, and all in the last half year to last few months. Market research agencies such as Food Dive, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Mintech, Deloitte, McKinsey & Co., also Infinity Research, BMO Capital Markets, and Kearney. There's been a scan of some academic journals in the agri-food sector, Food Quality and Safety, Canadian Journal of Agricultural Economics, and business and supply chain industry publications. So BetaKit, Which 50, Spend Matters, The Economic Times, Logistics Management, Packaging Strategy, Consumer Goods Forum, and Freight Waves. So the first I'd like to emphasize and mention is really this sourcing of raw ingredients. And in food consumer goods, this is more important than ever. It's critical for a food product company, whether it's a jam, let's say, or a beverage product, or any sort of canned good, that consistency of raw ingredient supply, whether those are spices or fruits or some sort of vegetable or meat or a dairy, this is super important. So there's been a major dynamic change around that. During COVID, there's also been significant increases in demand for certain ingredients, as people have, of course, we knew in the news that everybody was hoarding hand sanitizer and toilet rolls, but also major agencies that are tracking these ingredients that are traded internationally, such as ginger and turmeric, rose at one point in 2020 by 300%, as people were seeking to find immunity boosting ingredients for their homes. And of course, canned goods and baker's yeast, just like the question earlier, that people are baking. So these dynamics are in fact impacting what is available and the prices related to that. And so many consumer goods companies are really engaged in thinking about their suppliers and the raw ingredients and materials that they're sourcing. This has also meant shifts in inventory and storage and pricing related to that. Packaged goods and their supply partners have had to deal with these disruptions in distribution, inventory, and storage capacity because of restrictions between different regions, between provinces, in the case of course, here in Canada, in our trade with the US, and then also between different countries in shipping and importing and exporting of ingredients or finished products. And this also, of course, is having an implication on prices, fluctuations in those ingredients, like, for example, ginger, as was mentioned, or in materials, in packaging, and in, let's say, in preserving materials. And this all depends, of course, on availability and storage capacity. And just as one example, a case example of India setting restrictions on the import or export of its spices has had implications through the supply chain for that sourcing. I think it's also important to note that in Canada, many of our CPG, our food CPG companies, our processing companies are smaller. That to say, under 100 employees is the average, is the most common. 90% of Canadian food processing companies are actually under 100 people. So they are often more vulnerable to these fluctuations. In the part of the GTA that I live in, I know that there's many smaller restaurants and food providers that have had a hard go of things in the last year, and there's a higher liquidity risk and less amounts of working capital, and this has led to either bankruptcies or definitely protection in some of the federal programs that are available. And so there is a major pressure on smaller and medium-sized CPG companies to be adept and adapting to this impact of COVID and what the future will bring as well. A specific example that I just want to highlight is really the meat processing plants and also its associated worker safety. It's been in the news in various elements. Food packaging goods in meat and dairy have been particularly impacted by the COVID pandemic. Meat processing employees are often, working in close quarters and where transmission can then be easier. And in certain cases, workers also maybe have English as a second language, which then further places emphasis on the requirements for health and safety training with the workers in any plant. In the US, for example, we've seen over 450 meat packing companies that have been affected by COVID. In Canada, it's not foreign to us either. Workers have contracted COVID in the spring at the Cargill plant in Alberta, at the Old Mill pork plant in Quebec, and actually just announced at the beginning of this week at the Belmont meat plant in Toronto, which was a new variant of COVID. So this is still very much front and center, especially in the meat processing sector, which is one of Canada's strengths. And these outbreaks and subsequent closures or temporary closures impact the supply chain. It impacts ingredients for, let's say, ready-to-eat foods, frozen. Imagine, let's say, your frozen lasagna or what you're buying. All of these have meat ingredients in them or dairy ingredients, and it has an impact. It can have an impact on culling of animal herds or dairy products in some cases, and increases in prices or fluctuations. And then also the actual workforce in the animal protein sector may be further vulnerable in taking public transit or may lack access to health insurance and sick leave. So that could also have a dynamic effect in the meat processing sector. And these elements are also having serious operational costs. Chief operating officers and the operational teams in many food packaging companies are aware about sanitation costs, the need for personal protection equipment, staggering shifts. What are the costs of social distancing to make sure that staff are safe, and also the training and the continual retraining as well that needs to take place for CPGs in general and for meat and dairy in particular. What also is really evident in most recent developments in terms of supply chains is ingredients, whether it's sourcing it and the ingredients that go into the food, or the packaging and the substitutions that now need to be on the radar. So packaging may require modifications to size, sometimes scaling up the package or scaling down. Some of these food CPGs that have provided for the food service sector, maybe for restaurants or cafeterias or institutions, are now having less of an opportunity there. So they're shifting or pivoting to grocers or direct to customers. So this requires material reconsiderations, usability and reusability. And as I'll elaborate in a moment, also the carbon footprint and the types of packaging that are being used is increasingly of consideration, the environmental and reusability factors. And I think it's important to note that ingredient dependence in Canada, in particular, for example, on our produce, whether that is fruits and vegetables, many of them for Canadians, especially in our winters, come from Mexico or California. I think increasingly we'll need to consider that if these regions face drought, then they might have pressures and price pressures or availability pressures. And as well in Southern Ontario in particular, we have seasonal temporary workers coming and working, which has, we are dependent on them for our vegetable and fruit crop productions in our greenhouses and in the Holland Marsh in Ontario. These are all elements of consideration for ingredients, especially for produce, so fruits and vegetables. Ingredients and packaging substitutions as well. So further on that, so there are costs to these alternates. In some cases, whether it's, let's say, ginger or some sort of product that cannot be grown in Canada, then that will be a serious factor of consideration. Maybe greenhouses are upping their capacity, but that may have cost implications for Canadians to produce for Canadians in fresh fruits and vegetables. And then there may be factors of embargoes from regions, as was mentioned, and countries of supply. So this element of ingredient substitution is very much growing as an important element of the supply chain. And then being aware as that food processing company of the accuracy of consumer buyer demand is very important to be attuned to that. How precise is that? Is this a potential fad or a trend, or will have lasting implications for packaging design, and ingredient substitution? There is also, I think, very important to draw attention to upstream demand pressures on food CPG from consumers and grocers. So in the groceries, there is growing emphasis for less SKUs, less products, and there seems to be a growing trend towards larger ready-to-eat packaged meals, and also fresh fruits and vegetables, and fresh baked goods. And this also has implications for meeting consumer preferences, so portion sizes, and how is it that CPGs are also attuned to this growing trend of consumer and grocer demand. Also, grocers and retailers are pressured for reducing inventories in their warehousing and considering factors of perishability. And from that point of view as well, upstream pressures on social production factors by consumers. Are consumers aware and growing their pressure via social media about worker safety and about ingredient supply conditions? So how is it that the ingredients that are in my packaged good, what are my choices as a consumer, and what do I choose to have? There is also governance of the organization. So again, social media scrutiny of those brands and choices that people make of one over the other, depending on what the consumer is seeking. So sustainability and brand, and then transparency and traceability. These are also of growing concern upstream for the food CPGs. In that context, I think it's important, two major developments that have happened actually very recently, just this year. There is growing investor pressure where boards of companies have ESG mandates, ESG standing for environment, social, and governance. In a statement by PricewaterhouseCoopers, 80% of institutional investors have an ESG component as part of their investment strategy, but only 27% fully integrated ESG criteria into their long-term decision making. So suffice to say that this is increasingly on the radar, and supply chains will need to be thinking about these elements for what is part of a packaged goods profile. There's business to business and business to customer regulation and pressure. And there's a growing body of supply chain metrics by governments, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, by industry. These acronyms are the Task Force on Financial Disclosure and the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. Regulatory elements such as carbon taxes on materials and ingredients in the food supply chain. Consumer groups that also allow for certification, whether that's fair trade or organic or free from. Carbon footprint, water footprint, all of these elements will be considerations for the food packaging company and their supply chain to take these things into consideration. There has been big announcements this week, actually. A recent pilot project partnership has been developed between Loblaws and Tim Hortons and Loop, which is owned by TerraCycle, which is a reusable packaging initiative. And the objective of that will be that it's a pilot project, and Loblaws will have some of its commonly used everyday consumer products. So imagine your ketchups and your often reused beverages and condiments will be available for return. Currently, the way it will work is that you will have to only access it. It will only be accessed via e-commerce. And then the plan will be that it's something almost like the beer bottle return system that we have at the Ontario Beer Store. So it will be some sort of recycling program like that. It is a pilot project, and we'll see where it goes. But this is something that has also impelled and created packaging redesign. So speaking again about the packaging supply chain partnerships that Loblaws has actually developed packaging that is compatible with this Loop program. And also announced just this week is the Food, Health and Consumer Products Canada, and many leading CPGs, Coca-Cola, Unilever, Kraft Heinz, Maple Leaf, Danone, General Mills, have created the Canada Plastics Pact. And the emphasis on this is by 2025, so in just 4 years, pressure on packaging design modification, supply chain partnerships will set targets for addressing problematic packaging, greater use of recycled and compostable materials, and greater recycling by content weight. And one of the other major points that I think is really worth focusing attention on is the digitization of the entire supply chain for food consumer goods. And this is probably one of the most important points to emphasize in the presentation. And that is systems and software and programs that allow for the tracking, procurement, and transparency along the supply chain. Cooperation as well between partners, so whether that's upstream with retailers and distributors, or downstream for the food CPG with its ingredient suppliers or its packaging suppliers, or actually even from on-farm production, will be the objective. Now, there's no denying that this is not easy, that sometimes various partners in the supply chain benefit from control of the information of their part in the process. So there is definitely emphasis on how to get to that win-win, and also understanding some of the controls of data that may be more easy to work with and some that will remain proprietary. And e-commerce is definitely here and growing and here to stay in many ways, even when we start to open up and are allowed to go to stores much more easily. And I think, just as an example, to shine a spotlight on this, a company that is based here in Toronto that is called Tealbook has really received a lot of attention in the media lately. They provide a cloud-based application for procurement information. So consumer packaged goods companies, manufacturers can have much greater optics using their database for advanced AI systems and machine learning to organize, access, and to vet almost the procurement process. So this company, Tealbook, is really catching this momentum with supply chain evolution and innovation here in Canada. And responsive supply chain, so this is the third element. These are elements of the new normal that I think we could argue are going to be here to stay. Responsiveness, I think, is one of the most important elements in this. And this from upstream signals. So what are some of the management decision-making and management leadership factors that will shorten the time between demand signals and production adjustments? So what's meant by that? If the leadership in a food CPG notices that consumers want a different packaging size, that they want different ingredients, that they might want to integrate some environmental aspect, or there may be some convenience aspect to the packaging that the consumer wants, or a different flavor profile, or a health and wellness profile, how quickly and how confidently can the food CPG team pivot its production and its supply chain adjustments? And some of these software tools and programs that allow for that visibility are helping exactly with that. Manufacturing responsiveness will also be critical in the operations. So whether it's safety and training to products, these are kind of the example we could see with Loblaws and Loop in its modification to its packaging. And this responsive supply chain will be business to business and business to consumer, and cutting down that that response time. And also the regulatory elements that go with that. The approvals through the Canadian Food Inspection Agency or any sort of regulatory aspects will be super critical. So as I mentioned, so communications response as well, so that there's a clear ongoing public relations and consumer feedback loop. I think it's interesting, speaking briefly about small and medium-sized enterprises who have often had a bit more of a struggle in reaching that capacity, let's say, compared to what Loblaws is strongly capable of. An interesting case study is Best of Calgary Foods, which is a group of small food purveyors and artisans who joined forces last year to be able to provide a single platform for delivering their artisan food and craft products to the Calgary population. and they have done this through an e-commerce platform and direct-to-consumer delivery. So it's an example, I think, a positive example of smaller food packaged goods companies joining forces and coming up with a business model that works for them. And I think it's also, each case will be unique. So a bread CPG company may be different in its responsiveness compared to a meat or a dairy company compared to a more perishable or less perishable. Each of these will have different pressures, where they source their raw ingredients, if they need to provide alternate sources. These are all going to be case by case specific. And facilitating this will be, again, this end-to-end visibility with advanced data and information that will lead to wise, actionable business moves. I think procurement strategy, I think, is one thing that I also want to leave as an important point. Procurement really is that downstream signaling. So where are those ingredients going to come from? What are some of those new relationships that we as a food CPG need to be thinking about? There is many tools that can come to bear on this. Cost modeling and mapping. So thinking about the ingredient supply, the alternate, how long of a season of alternates do we need to consider? Can we have ingredient substitutions for, let's say, our most basic elements, such as like sugars or fats in our product, as an example? What about transportation and logistics and warehousing and inventory? So all these are all going to be important elements in the procurement strategy. And then modeling and planning alternates to this with suppliers, with the ingredients and materials. And consideration as well, I think there's growing awareness of omni-channel fulfillment. What does that mean? Responding to potential disruptions across a whole spectrum of factors in the supply chain, whether that is ability to distribute, getting the products to the plant, getting them away. In a October 2020 survey of 70 companies, 60% of CPGs now plan to increase their investment in multiple facilities that can respond to online orders or various direct-to-retail orders. 56% of CPGs plan to increase investments in these analytical tools and predictive planning and demand forecasting. And over half of CPGs also plan to increase investments in these flexible operations. So the ability to pivot and respond quicker to that signal to modify the product as needed. So I think that is it. I hope that that has brought some questions up. I think we have some good amount of time. And also, if you have anything more that is a bit more detailed as well, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, or my email is in the notes here.
Thanks very much, Mark. As Mark indicated, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. So Mark, I have a question to start it off. Getting back to digitization, how difficult do you think it'll be to get cooperation from supply chain partners on this?
Yeah, so that is definitely an important question, and it's a good question to start with, because it's not, I wouldn't want to be naive to think that this is an easy thing, that there is often proprietary information about that price sensitivity. So some of the analysts and thinkers on this are trying to pose this as a win-win, as how do you, so that's an often used term, but how can you potentially develop contracts and partnerships that would recognize the consistency of partnership and trading by sharing certain critical data, so that both the supplier of that, let's say, that ingredient, and the purchaser of that ingredient will then have a much more better ability to pivot and to adjust the product given what we know is signals coming upstream. That's one initial way to think about it, but I don't claim to have a complete answer to that either.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Um, a question from our attendees. With food safety in mind, do you see the trend of individually wrapped goods like we see with produce continuing, or will food processors look towards less packaging in the future post-COVID?
Yes, it's a very important question, and it's a catch-22, or it's a paradox, because I think some of the studies that we've done at Dalhousie have actually brought this to light, that actually since we've been with COVID and the pandemic, that there has been a increase in packaging and in disposable packaging because of food safety. So there is the major pressure on for consumers, and also for that ability to provide a safe packaged product. I think that uh, it's hard. It's hard. So, for example, Tim Hortons is now part of this Loop partnership, which is with the objective of being able to have a cup or some sort of package with law, in the case of Loblaws, that you will bring back to, or it will be picked up by FedEx at your home. There's a cost involved, so that also is going to have implications for who can afford that, and the dynamics and practicality of that. So there is definitely going to be, I think, uh, critical thinking and tough strategy thinking as to how to make this at once convenient and safe for people. So
Bit of a trade-off.
it's a bit of a trade-off and a fine balance.
Gotcha. I have another question from the audience, but one question to follow up to your last question there. Given that, this big announcement with the plastics agreement, and a lot of big CPGs are using the Loop platform right now, what does this mean for smaller food CPGs? When
Yes.
will they be able to take part in something like this, or how will this affect their strategies long term?
Yeah, that's so important, and so important, because we do it's quite telling, I would say, that two of Canada's largest food providers and food sectors, Loblaws and Tim Hortons Restaurant Brands International, are at the forefront of this, and the large CPGs are leading, which is a good thing. But also the majority, I think, of our food processing sector are people with companies with under 100 staff. So with that being said, how will this be addressed? Again, it's a tough one. I think that what gives me inspiration is some of these partnerships, like the Best of Calgary Foods, where maybe they're reaching a ability to scale. Maybe there might be some contract manufacturing where you actually have a CPG that can go to a manufacturer and develop a contract for something that is a modification, and that is a not as much of a heavy investment from the actual smaller food processor for what they're not able to, let's say, have in-house. So there may be, I think, creative thinking and some partnerships that could be useful here.
Thank you. Another great question. Are food manufacturers open to the idea of using a blockchain platform for food traceability?
Yeah, so that the element of blockchain, I didn't raise it in the presentation, because blockchain for me is also sometimes a little bit of a mystery, but I think it is coming front and center very, very much. And I think it could be something that addresses the previous question about how do you potentially get members in the supply chain to share their data. And I think that blockchain may be that hanging fruit that is a good way to enter this. So it will be important to track where blockchain is in this. And I think there are some leading examples of software developers and companies in Canada that are presenting blockchain as a useful tool for CPGs.
Okay, thanks. Another question. Sorry, it just popped up on me. How long do we expect the current container shortage to affect overseas shipments?
I think it's really case by case specific. So container shortages may be specific to what we're talking about. Whether it's Canadian export of what we have as one of our competitive advantages, which is in meat processing and seafood packaged seafood, packaged meats, which is a strength of Canada's, and grains and oil seeds. So what we can get out, and where we ship it, whether it's to Asian markets or European markets or Latin America. And then on the flip side, what is coming into Canada? Are we talking about the packaged material? Are we talking about, let's say, if it's glass or if it's a plastic material for packaging, and then the ingredient itself? So I think that bottleneck or that timeline is case by case specific, and I think it depends on what the food product is. So, for example, if your packaged product that is, let's say, a bestseller for your CPG contains ginger or turmeric or something that you've relied on in the Indian market for, then that may be something you're waiting for longer than if you can find an alternate from a different market, or if there's a substitution that you can develop, let's say, with a contractor at a greenhouse in Southern Ontario. These are all just hypothetical scenarios, but I think it's case by case specific, and some countries have been more prone to setting up trade blocks, maybe for protection of their own domestic food markets. So I would say case by case specific, if that answers the question.
Thank you. Next question is, digitalization and investment in robotics and AI systems will keep plants running, for example, meat plants, but will they be very disruptive to the labor force? Do you believe these investments will accelerate now post-COVID?
Yeah, that is a very important question, and I think at once, as a national and provincial and regional industry, the Canadian food industry, we seek to promote it. That's what we do at the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie. We would love to see more people in the sector. It is one of Canada's major employers, one of the biggest employers actually in Canada, and also to have a new generation of people excited to come into that. And I think that the general arc of history would be that, plants continue to advance and have more advanced robotics and automation to make those jobs more engaged. And there may be some sectors where automation is much more practical, and there may be sectors where it is less practical, where human hands and, let's say, the sensitivity of the product and how it is handled is an important consideration. So I think that's a million-dollar question, and a question of the ages, is this fine balance between automation, robotics, and human skill set. So I think that you can also, and that might also require some government partnerships, and we see that, from government programs, is continual retraining of the workforce as well for new advances in food science and technology, so that we have good quality, delicious, healthy foods that also employs people, and also that we're a leader, and we could be a leader internationally in sort of how we utilize new technologies, applied technologies.
Thanks. Another question, learning from the pandemic crisis, what are the priority areas for Canada to invest in to make food supply chain, our food supply chain, more robust?
Well, I think maybe as a case example, I give this attention and credit to a colleague, Evan Fraser, Dr. Evan Fraser, he's the director of the Aero Food Institute. He brought this to attention last week at a seminar he presented, and I think that's just a launching point for what Canada should be aware of and thinking about. I think that sustainability issues are not going to go away. In fact, I think that they will be increasingly of concern and consideration. And specifically, in Canada, we know the new National Food Guide emphasizes the eating of our fruits and veggies. It's very important for our health. We have beautiful crops here in the summertime and in the fall, a rich diversity. Across Canada, it's different examples, but we still rely highly on imports of our fruits and vegetables from California or from Mexico or wherever in the world they come from. And that could be something that we need to pay attention to, is what could that look like? If we look at the example of the Netherlands, they've invested in the Netherlands highly in greenhouses and speaking of automation of greenhouses where they produce a lot of their own fruits and vegetables in a country that is a northern climate country. So in Canada, we may see a good opportunity for that, to think about what we can produce in our own country, while at the same time, of course, being open and engaged with international markets for food, both for our exports and for import. And I think the other element that is really important is really thinking about our relationship with these applied technologies, whether it's robotics or automation or software, so that we can have an intelligent conversation about where to apply it, and at the same time that it creates jobs and opportunities. So what's that mean for training programs at our colleges and universities for the next generation? And also, I think I should say, very importantly, for mid-career professionals who maybe have been displaced by some of these new automations, what can we provide that is enhancements to skills sets for mid-career professionals? Sometimes that is not necessarily in the equation, but it needs to be increasingly so today.
That's a great point. Thank you, Mark. Well, there's no more questions. So on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology and Food in Canada magazine, we'd like to thank you, Mark, for your very informative presentation today. And I'd like to remind everyone that we are hosting webinars every second Wednesday until June, and again, then from September to November. Our next webinar is on February 17th and will feature Sylvain Charlebois. His topic is adaptation and rapid response in food processing, from pivoting to committing, e-commerce in the time of COVID and beyond. This webinar is being sponsored by Canadian CPGs. Thank you for attending, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.